Welcome to Between Authors. I'm your host, author Adrian Lopez. What is it that excites us as a reader? It's finding that book or author that you may never have heard of, sort of like the treasure hunt for a reader. The goal from my podcast is to bring to you those books or authors that you may never have found, but may be the treasure you've been searching for all along. Today in episode 40, I bring to you author Allison Spooner. We're going to go over a little bit about who she is, what she's published, what she's working on, and maybe what her plans are for the future. Welcome to the show, Allison.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm happy that you're here today. Why don't you begin by giving a little introduction to who you are to the viewers?
Perfect. Yeah, like we said, my name is Allison Spooner. I am the author of 2 collections of flash fiction, so short stories, all less or around 1,000 words, and my most recently published the novel, The Lost Girl, that came out in October of last year. So I am self-publishing. I've been writing all my life. I love inspiring other authors to write as well. So you can find lots of helpful tips and inspiration on all of my socials. And yeah, that's briefly about me. I know we'll get into all my books and plots and all of that later. So.
Okay, perfect. I just want to remind the viewers that I will leave all of your links down below in the description of the video. So, websites, book links, socials, anything you want to share out there will be down below for everybody to find there.
Awesome.
And it's one of the things that I appreciate because I love helping other authors as well where I can, right? Because it's one of the things that we all understand how much work this is, how much hard work this is to do it on your own, because you're doing everything, right? Marketing is you, right? Sales is you, and the whole thing is really on you. And any kind of support like you're doing, where you're giving, tips and stuff to have to do, or I try to do whatever I can to share everybody's work or get them out there. It's all appreciated, right? And it's just a great thing to kind of just share everybody's work and get it out there, because there's nobody else really doing it for us.
Yeah, I mean, and all the information, the other problem is all the information, it is out there, but there's also so much of it that it's so hard to know where to start. That's my biggest challenge, is sometimes I just get overwhelmed. Luckily, there is a lot of information out there now about self-publishing and what you need to be doing and things like that, but there's so much of it at this point that it's just, if you can tune into somebody else that's doing it and see like a 2-minute video about like, here's this little point that helped me, like that to me is super beneficial, rather than scouring the internet for the answer.
Yeah, and it's true, because there is, you try to search it, there's, I don't know how many YouTube videos, there's, I don't know how many websites, and there's always somebody trying to sell you, we can get you going and doing this, and stuff like that. When you do little videos like that, it is very helpful, because you can make it look, this is how I did it, and it's much more concise and clear. Like, these are your steps, right? Sometimes when you watch the long videos, or even you're reading the instructions, you're like, this is so much just wasted information sometimes, because you're like, I don't really need all that stuff. These 4 steps is really all I needed. And it's just sometimes confusing to those that haven't done it before.
For sure.
Yeah. So let's do this. Let's talk about what creatively influences you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be authors of books. It could be anything: art, music, movies.
Yeah. So I think really it's just good storytelling. So obviously books, I've always been a reader since I was really small, but one of the more unique things I talk about, which kind of influenced my flash fiction when that was kind of the primary thing that I was writing, is country music. So I've always been really impressed by the fact that so many country artists could tell such big stories in such a short amount of time. So like Garth Brooks, When the Thunder Rolls, The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia, Reba, Fancy, like those are such big stories, and you see the whole thing in your head, and it's about 3 minutes or so, depending on if it's the extended version or whatnot. But And I've been listening to country. Like I grew up in a small town, so that was kind of the primary, music and what you always heard. And I never realized how big of an influence it had on me until I was older and I was writing these short stories and trying to pack in so much information, and it kind of became my thing. People would tell me like, oh my gosh, you told such a big story, or oh my gosh, the twist at the end. And those stories always had that little twist at the end that you're like, oh my gosh. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I go back to when I think about what influences me. And even now, even into novels, like, my novel's 52,000-ish words. So it's not long. I do my best to pack the story in and tell it as concisely, but still be entertaining and emotional and all of that in a little package.
It's interesting too, because I've noticed that the trend towards playlists with everyone's books has become something you're starting to see a lot more. Like there's an actual playlist that goes along with your book, and sometimes there's a link to it in the back of the book or on the website.
Yeah.
Like if you're reading this book, here's the playlist that kind of goes along with the chapters, and it makes perfect sense because really, anything creatively, any kind of artwork, right? And whether it's movies, music, books, anything you're thinking of, it's really the emotions, right? The connection from that artwork. And that's music, right? That's essentially what music does. And like you said, when you look at some of the older stuff, right? When you look at old country, you look at old R&B, even go back to some of the old crooners and stuff in those songs, there was always a story. There's almost a full story in those songs, right? And that's sometimes where a lot of people don't understand. It's all those experiences that you have, which really leads to your unique author voice, right? You're pulling from your experiences from the country music, right? And some people pull from, like, a lot of my stuff is from my love for horror movies, a lot of those. And it's just you have that in the background, right? And that's kind of where your voice comes from. And it's just amazing, really, sometimes how that comes about. And you don't, like you said, you don't even realize it till later on. You're like, I didn't even notice that was such a big impact on my life.
Yeah, it's almost like you're chasing that feeling, but then wanting to give it to somebody else, right? Like I'm wanting to give someone else the feeling that I had when I experienced like When the Thunder Rolls for the first time, or like the emotional roller coaster that you go on when you experience these things. And even in movies and, TV, I always say, if something puts me in the mood to write, I know it's good. Like when I'm done watching something or listening to something or reading something, and now I'm in the mood to go tell my own stories, that's inspirational to me.
Yeah.
Anything that makes me like feel something is what I want to emulate for others.
Yeah, and really that's the beauty of art, right? Anything creative is that connection for the viewer, the reader, that the other one that's kind of getting what your emotions were. And it really goes back to, again, when you're genuine to your unique voice, then the readers will feel that. They'll feel that connection to what you're trying to do. And again, it's a beautiful thing. A lot of people don't realize how beautiful that connection is to the reader and to the author, because it does connect, right? There's so many readers that will connect to that. And I want to say that's probably the hardest thing, because every author has an audience out there, right? For that voice. How do you find them, right? That's what we're all trying to figure out, is there's an audience for my work, for your work, for everybody's work, right? Everybody has an audience, but how do you get the eyes of that audience on your work? And that's really where a lot of the struggle is for us indie authors, is trying to figure this out and get that to get in that direction.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Not everybody can be on the radio for millions of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another quick question before we really go into your books, because I do want to go a little more depth into that. And you mentioned something that's very similar to what I wanted to do, and you said how you wanted to keep your books right around 50,000 and very concise, right? And that was something that I really wanted to kind of do myself. And it's probably a little different approach than a lot of authors, because a lot of authors, and I want to use the right term here because I don't want to say it wrong, is a lot of times there's more description, more words to explain a scene or something as you're moving into it, and they're beautiful, right? They're so well done, but a lot of times I'm like, okay, I didn't need that much setup to get to the scene, because the scene to me is more important than that whole setup to get to the scene. And I wanted to do it in a way too where it is more concise, and yeah, you're still giving description and explaining the atmosphere or what's going on, but I wanted to do it where you're focusing on what you really want to get across is really that scene, and not
Mhm.
really have so much description leading into the thing. Um, and it's just I didn't know if that was going to be well received, because you do hear so much of that, more of the show don't tell, but really kind of just walk you through, what did the air smell like, and how was the wind, and again, I'm not saying it's wrong or right. I'm just saying I came from a little different direction, and it sounds like maybe you kind of did the same.
Yeah, yeah, because I don't love a ton of description in the books I'm reading. So and that's just, I mean, that's just me and my personal preference. But I know that if I have that preference, then there's probably people out there too that have.
Exactly.
And I actually saw a TikTok on this, and I can't think of the person, but she's great and offers really awesome advice. But she said that sometimes offering too much description, like of a character's appearance, can actually hinder kind of the experience of the reader too, because they want to kind of picture them the way they want to picture them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if you try to describe that character down to the shape of their face, the shape of their nose, like if you're constantly talking about what they look like, then that's going to kind of hinder the reader's ability to picture it themselves. And I know that I liked doing that when I was young. I liked having an image kind of that I thought of myself. And I would often find myself skimming over descriptions if they went on too long. I mean, Stephen King is infamously guilty of this. Whether you love him or hate him, he has a lot of description, right? And I have to say, like, I don't think I even finished it because of the long descriptions. And I don't know, I read another book where they spent 2 pages describing the bathroom. I'm like, not Stephen King. It was
No.
another author, but I'm like, I just don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I want to get to the story. I want to get to the emotions. I want to get to what the character is experiencing, and take the reader on a really quick, fast-paced, emotional journey. And if you're stopping good description is worked in well throughout the story anyway, but if you're spending a lot of time talking about what each character looks like, and you're going to take them out of the story. So for me, that's just my personal preference. And like I said, if I feel like that, then somebody else out there feels like that, and I'll have super short attention spans these days anyway. So
Yeah, that is definitely correct. But yeah, I mean, and that's why I wanted to bring it up, because I felt the same way, right? I felt the same way in saying that, again, I know there's an audience for that shorter approach to it, right? And like you said, if I kind of appreciate it, I know there's more people out there, and so that's why I did the same thing. So it's very interesting to hear that you kind of feel the same way, and went the same direction.
yeah, and it's another perk of being an indie author, right? Like, we have that freedom to choose that.
Yeah,
I'm not going to add words to my story just to fit a qualification, a genre qualification put in place by the industry, because, you know, young adult books are generally 70 to 100,000 words or something like that. Like, I'm not going to just put in more story to meet a word requirement. Because then if I'm doing that, it's just going to start to feel forced, and the reader's going to notice.
Not genuine, right? It's not genuine anymore. And again, that's the beauty of indie, right? The beauty of being self-published is you don't have to do anything, right? You can do anything you want, and that's really the beauty of it, right? And again, there will be somebody out there that appreciates it. And again, it goes back to, why does it have to be 70,000 words? Why does it have to this? Really, when you think about it, right? Is the reader actually sitting there and saying, "Oh, wait a minute, this is only 65,000. This is definitely I'm upset here."
Yeah, you know, I'm not going to keep this. The
stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, you know, it's the beauty really of that. Yeah. Is it a lot harder? Yes. Is there so much more work? Yes. But even if you're traditionally published, you're still marketing yourself, right? Unless you're really with one of the big ones and you're on top of their list, right? But again, how many is that? It's like, how many players make it to the NFL from college? Very few. You can't count that that's what's going to happen. So the balance of having full creative control of your work and probably still doing the same amount of work the other one's going to do, it's probably worth going the other route, right? And again, but there is no right or wrong on that side of it.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I do appreciate is, and I do this with everything, whether it's music, movies, or books or anything, is I appreciate always when somebody comes from a different angle on something, right? When they don't do the norm, right? And you talked about like having a twist or something in there, and you know, when it's not that normal formula based twist, so that normal formula, like, again, I love horror movies, right? But what happens is so many times it's like the mother with the children and the father just passed away and they're moving back home and the home's haunted and, you know, the devil lives in the basement or something. But it's always that you're like, just, you know, why can't you just change? It doesn't have to be the same formula. And it's just so refreshing, and I appreciate it when they do come from that different angle, right? And you just even if maybe the story's not the best, you just appreciate that. You're like, this is all new. It's all refreshing for that reason.
For sure. Yeah, definitely.
So let's
Go ahead.
Yeah, let's talk about your books, right? So before we get into your novel that just released in October, let's talk about the flash fiction you kind of did before that. And, you know, how did that come about? You know, you just give us a little kind of history on that.
Yeah, for sure. So try to keep the short version here of how I get into it. So I think I mentioned I've always been a writer. I've always loved writing, you know, since I was yay high. I knew I wanted to be a writer. But, you know, as I got older and, you know, I wrote books and books and books and notebooks filled with things through middle school and high school. And then like you get into adult and life happens. And I was trying to figure out, you know, what type of novel I wanted to write, what type of writer I wanted to be. I just knew I wanted to be published. Like, you published a novel, you were a writer if you published a novel, at least when I was trying to do this. You shopped it out, you got picked up, you got your book on the bookshelf. That's how it worked. So I was trying to figure out the best story I wanted to tell, the one that would turn into a novel. And I had so many false starts, and it started to kind of affect my confidence. And I, you know, couldn't write because I couldn't think of anything to write. And it was this vicious cycle. So I was really kind of stuck, and eventually kind of in the midst of all of this. And I didn't even feel like a writer, right? Because writers have novels, writers have books. That's what makes us writers. So I was really kind of struggling with all of that. And I discovered through some events in my hometown and also online writing contests, I discovered flash fiction. So there was an event here in town that would challenge people to write a 440 word story using a 3-word prompt that they would give you. And then you could go to the event and read your story with everyone. And it was really fun. And so I started going to that, and that was really neat. And I then online, NYC Midnight hosts different contests, like quarterly contests. And one was short stories, but one was flash fiction. And so I kind of discovered that, and they would always give a prompt. And that really helped me kind of get out of my head and out of what I thought I might want to write about, and forced me to write about something I would have never written about, because some of them even gave genre requirements. So like suddenly I was writing sci-fi stories, and I've never been interested in writing sci-fi, but it was super fun. And so I was doing these events and doing these contests, but I was still like mad at myself for not having a novel. I was like, I don't have anything published. I haven't written a novel. I'm not a writer. And I just kind of looked around and realized I had all these stories that I'd been writing for these events. And like at that point, self-publishing had kind of started. Amazon had KDP, and you had a little more freedom to just put your own stuff out there. And I was like, I have a book. It's not a novel, but it's a book. Like it's enough stories to fill a book. And so I just decided to publish, and that was Flash in the Dark, my very first one. And again, not huge, but still a book. About 20 short stories of 1,000 words or less. A lot of them are less than 500. And a lot of them, most of them were written for either that event or a contest online and using prompts. So that's kind of, flash fiction ended up being the thing that kind of got me writing again after being really, really stuck, and made me realize that I was a writer, even if I didn't have a novel, even if I wasn't published. I was a writer, and that I could just write what I wanted and still be a writer.
Yeah, I mean, it's prompts are very, very useful. I do a lot of them for poetry side when they have the prompt, like here's a photo or here's a couple of words, and it's very, very useful to bring out that creative side when you're looking at some of that stuff. And like you said, when it takes you away from your comfort zone, right? When it's not something you normally write. But it's a good technique if you feel stuck and you're having trouble pulling it out, right? But it really goes back to, again, the like you're saying, at the point you're like, I don't have a book, I don't have a book out there. Am I a writer, right? Can I even do this? But it's one of the things I always like to mention is that I always want because it's easier now to self-publish, right? But if that wasn't there, I always want the younger writers to understand, if you don't get picked up, if you don't get chosen, it's not really a knock against your skill or talent, right?
Yeah.
Because generally, and whether or not you submit 50 queries or however many you submit, it's still usually one person reading it, right? And it's you're never going to make everybody happy with what you write, so don't feel bad if that one person passes on it, right? And then if that person is repping a company that it's not really their genre, or they're like, we got way too much of this genre, we're looking for this, again, it's not necessarily a knock against your talent. And even more so when you're doing a unique voice, like you and I, coming from a shorter, more concise version, probably would have automatically got knocked down and said, nah, this is 20,000 words short, and there's not enough in it, because maybe that one reader that the agent are looking at that's what they look for, right? So it's never a knock against talent, and that's I always want the younger writers to understand that. Don't get down, because it's when you do get down, like you were saying, and you lose that spark, and it's sometimes very hard to get back.
Yeah, it definitely took some time for me to get back, but when I did, then I got back into writing these stories, and that's what eventually like worked that muscle and got it going again, and led to, the idea eventually for my novel. So my other flash fiction collection is The Problem with Humans, and other stories. I always say it's not thick enough to cover all the problems with humans, but it is named after one of the stories in the book. So
I don't even think an encyclopedia collection could cover all the problems.
No. But it does attract people. I always say it was the best thing I ever did, naming this book, giving the book this title, because it stops people in their tracks all the time.
And these are all available on Amazon, correct?
Yes. Yep. These are available on Amazon, or through my website. You can buy signed copies directly from me.
Okay.
If you don't want to, feed Bezos. But they are printed through Amazon. So even if you're buying them from me, you're still kind of feeding them, but it's fine.
Yeah, I know.
Those at least printed through Amazon.
So let's talk about your new release book, or the book you released back in October.
Yeah. And so finally, after, I shouldn't say finally, because I was still writing. I love all my stories. Eventually, I came up with the idea for The Lost Girl, a Neverland story. I keep picking up this book that has like schmutz on it. And then I go to show my camera and I'm like, it cleans off. But it's always the one I pick up. It is a young adult Neverland adventure. So it's about Peter Pan's great-granddaughter, 13-year-old great-granddaughter. And when she is diagnosed with a terminal illness, her mom sends her to Neverland to see if it will save her life. And so in Neverland, she meets lost boys. She has run-ins with pirates. She has all these different challenges as she's also facing her own mortality, what that means to her. She's no longer with her mother. And if, she's kind of facing the dilemma, if Neverland does save her life, does that mean, she's got to stay there forever and be away from her mom? So she's got all these emotions. She's 13, so she's already feeling a lot of things, but she's now dealing with her own mortality and a bunch of annoying lost boys and pirates and all of that. There's a lot going on, all in 52,000 words.
So is this available in all options? Is it on unlimited, or is it just an ebook and paperback, or?
Paperback, ebook, Kindle Unlimited. You can get it through my website, signed copies directly from me. No audiobook at the moment, but who knows? Maybe someday.
Have you thought about that? Something I originally thought about too, but I haven't. As with everything, it's funds, right? Do you have the funds to do it? But it was something I thought about at some point. Also trying that, I just currently can't afford to do it.
Yeah, I think I might give it a whirl with my short story collections and just do it myself. I enjoy reading out loud. I've, been told I have a good speaking voice. And I think at least with the short stories, I totally believe that, you need a professional to make something like this, like be really entertaining. But for my short stories, they're so short, they're so quick. I think that's something I could do myself and at least get those out there in the audio format and start there and go from there.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. If you do that those would probably be very good, choices for like TikToks to explain, this is my journey doing the individual ones for the audiobooks and stuff, because it's an option that a lot of authors know, but I don't know if a lot of authors have gone that direction of doing it themselves, of trying to do it and releasing it. But like you say, if it's a much bigger novella or novel, it's probably better to give it to the professionals to do that.
Yeah. So it'll be fun to try that. We'll see. It's also time. Yeah. Not just money, but time. So we'll see.
Which is usually what we all have very little of.
Yes.
So let's talk a little more about your book. Did you have a favorite scene in the book?
Oh gosh, when you said that, I was like, I was racking my brain, and all of them are so much fun. I think any scene between Angela and the Lost Boys, when they're really kind of, really interacting was really, really fun. I guess there's one in particular when she kind of first gets to Neverland, and so a little background that takes place after the events of the movie Hook.
Okay.
If you're familiar, you don't have to be familiar with the movie to understand what's going on, but just in the universe of Peter Pan, that's because in order for Peter Pan to have a granddaughter, he would have had to come home, grow up, have children.
Yeah.
And so this takes place many years after the event of Hook. So the Lost Boys are explaining what happened to Hook. So they're almost kind of reenacting a scene from Hook. Just summarizing it, because you can summarize. That's within copyright law. But they're kind of just describing it to her, and they're acting it out, and they're being really dramatic about it. And so obviously they're embellishing the facts and things like that. And so that was really fun to write, mostly because I love the movie Hook too. So it was really kind of fun. And then I talk about a little bit of what might have been going on behind the scenes of that scene. So it's kind of very meta. And I liked the movie so much that I liked telling it through their point of view, and then thinking about what might have been going on behind the scenes during that. I don't want to give too much away, but so if you like the movie Hook, if you read this, you'll find that fun little Easter egg where they're describing a moment, and see if you can picture what moment it is from the movie that they're talking about. So that was really fun to write. So I think that's probably, and that's when I choose to read out loud a lot if I'm doing readings or events or anything like that, because it's really fun to read the boys telling that story.
Yeah,
with them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there is no right or wrong answer in terms of what your favorite scene is, right? And usually every time I do ask that question, a lot of the authors are like, I don't know. but you do wind up, like you said, you do wind up going, you know what, I do. This is kind of one I really enjoyed. But you do have to think about it for a second, right? Like if somebody asked me the question, I don't know what I would pick in my book either, because there's a lot of scenes that I wrote that I really kind of enjoyed.
Yeah.
But it is a kind of a difficult question sometimes to kind of pinpoint, right? What was the one that really you truly enjoyed?
Well, that was one that, and I guess I can't even say favorite. Favorite is really hard. That was the one probably that was my favorite to write. I guess that was the most fun to write. But in terms of favorite, in the end, it would probably vary day to day too, based on what I feel like, based on my emotional state. When I was doing read throughs and editing, there were different scenes that, depending on the day, would make me emotional. Some days this scene wouldn't have any effect on me, but then I would reread it to go make an edit 2 days later, and I would be all misty eyed. So it's all just like a reader, because I'm a reader first and foremost. It's going to affect you differently depending on where you are in life.
Yep. So let's go. I have the question on the opposite end, right? What was the hardest scene in the book?
I don't know if I can say, because it might give a spoiler.
You don't need to, right? Like I said, I don't want you to give away anything that you're not comfortable with.
Yeah, there is a scene that was very hard to do, that I did not want to do. So I guess that's kind of all I will say. And if you've read the book, if somebody is watching and they've read it, you probably know what I'm talking about. And if, once you read, you will probably figure it out. So I will say that. And I'll say the end. The end was really hard to write, mostly because I didn't want it to end, and for various, again, spoilers, but for various reasons. The end was tough, but it was all, all for the plot, right? All for the story, for the reader. for the experience. But I guess I can't say more than that.
Yeah, that's fine. Like I said, I never want you to share more than you're comfortable with. So the other question I usually have for the book is research, right? What kind of and technically you have answered a bit of that because the fact that it is, it takes place after the movie Hook. So Hook is kind of, even though it's not a direct storyline, it is kind of like a back end of it. That is research, right? That is research that kind of leads into that. But did you do any additional ones as you were writing this?
Yeah, so it's funny. I did a video on this on TikTok, actually, talking because I got asked this in a book club that my book was a part of. And I did the video, and I completely forgot when I was making the video that I did actually reread the original Peter Pan. Like when I sat down to start writing this, I was like, you know what? Like I knew the story, obviously, because I grew up watching Hook and I grew up watching the Mary Martin version of Peter Pan, which I can touch on too. But I remembered after I made the video for TikTok that I actually went back. I was like, I should probably just reread the original. Like it was not my intention to, this is very far from the original, but I did want to stick kind of to the original tone. So Peter Pan is actually kind of dark if you really think about it. And the original Peter Pan, there's a lot of dark undertones. And so to be kind of be true to that, I did go back and read the original. And there were things now that I can't remember specifically, but I remember writing down being like, oh yeah, I definitely want to make sure kind of to include that or keep with that, that I, included. And off the top of my head, I can't think of what those are, but I did go back and read the original. So that was a little bit of research. I've been researching this, inadvertently my whole life by watching, Hook over and over. And like I said, my brother and I grew up watching, don't know who in this audience would remember it, the Mary Martin version of Peter Pan. They did a stage version, a stage play that was like recorded and put on TV as like a special production. And if you're old like me, you might have had it recorded from your television on VHS.
I'm right in that boat too, so don't worry about that.
So we had that tape that we watched over and over and over that had the commercials fast forwarded through, or that you could fast forward, and so that all of that was already in my brain. And I watched Hook a couple times as I was writing just to get re-inspired, and there's some chaos happening in the background. Yeah, so that was my research, reading Peter Pan and remembering all what I loved about Hook and the other versions of Peter Pan.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Like you're talking about the original Peter Pan, but it's interesting how many of those old children's nursery rhymes, old stories, how dark a lot of them really were, or the backstories of a lot of them. You're like, you start thinking like, this is pretty twisted a lot of times.
Yeah,
but,
yeah,
but it's what molded a lot of us really with these stories, especially like again the slightly older generation. Even if it wasn't the stories from when you were a child, like I was born in 71, so that those stories are way before that, but they're around, right? They're still part of that. Your parents or your grandparents, there's maybe their copies of the books are out or something like that. But yeah, it's crazy how dark a lot of those stories really, really were back then.
Yeah, and I think that's why I wanted to stick to that tone. A lot of my stories in my collections are pretty dark. You may not know it just by looking at me, but a lot of them are very dark and creepy, and actually lean more toward kind of horror, like subtle horror. And like, obviously this doesn't look like that either, but Neverland and Peter and escaping to Neverland and never growing up, if you really kind of think about it, is kind of a scary, dark concept. Like, where do you have to be in life to want to escape so completely, or to never grow up? Like, Angela is very reluctant, and it's very obvious at the beginning, so it's not spoiler, but she's very reluctant to go. But where do you kind of have to be in life to make that choice intentionally, to run away and choose to never grow up? And so that's always fascinated me, that even if it's not obviously dark, and if you don't understand a lot of those subtleties, it's not, right? It's a fun place to go and have adventures and things like that. But I liked that. As we grow up, we understand a little more about Neverland and what it might have to be to truly like want that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and as like you said, if you're a younger reader or coming in from your youth, you aren't not going to understand that, right? You're like, well, I don't see why that's a bad thing.
Yeah,
until later on, as you go through more experience, more growth with stuff, and you're like, okay, wait a minute, this is much different thing that I notice now than I did before.
Yeah. And I think hopefully I did that well and got it across, because I have been told by readers that it's kind of for all ages. I think younger readers will, just appreciate that it's Neverland and there's adventure and there's this 13-year-old strong female, character, but there's the themes of mortality and facing our fears and, inner strength and things like that the adults that have read it have really appreciated. So it's marketed as young adult just because she's 13 and it just worked out that way. But luckily it's been said that it's a great read for all ages. And I think that's why, because there are those darker, subtle undertones that you might not truly understand and appreciate until you're an adult.
Yeah. And what's interesting too, and again, that's why I love doing this podcast, right? For one, I get to meet authors like yourself, and the viewers get to meet you guys, because a lot of times they don't get to see the author. They don't get to see the author's personality or why they wrote the stuff, or really know the person, right? Or again, what the author's willing to share on that side.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is, without this interview, right, without us talking right now, I never would have known that your stuff leans a little to the darker side, or subtle horror, right? And that really, if people are watching this, may open you up to more readers, knowing that there are those undertones, right, where you don't necessarily see that. I interviewed another author, Hannah McGuire, and when you're looking at her cover and her story and stuff, I didn't even realize till she told me there's vampires and all this stuff. I was like, wait a minute, I didn't even realize that was in there. And again, that's the beauty of this, right? To really get the readers and the viewers to understand more what the book's about, because there's only so much you can do in the blurbs and the short little TikTok videos or just little. There's only so much you can get across, right? Unless you're just basically sitting here and you're talking for 20 minutes about your book, it's hard to get that across. And that's what, the beauty of this is the readers will understand really where your book's coming from, or kind of where you're coming from. Because like I said, I didn't even realize that you had those undertones in your books. So you have this book done, right? So, and this is a standalone, right? There's like, meaning, and there's not necessarily probably a book two, but sometimes some authors keep the world around, and there's other side stories in the world, right? The world of their book. But I'm assuming this is probably just a standalone story on this part, not necessarily, but for now, right?
For now, yes.
Yeah. Is there something you're working on now, or something you have started thinking about writing, like a current whip or something?
Yeah. So I am momentarily taking a break from Neverland. And my next book is actually with first readers at the moment. So first draft is out there with my readers, and hoping to publish that by this October. So 1 year from the publication of The Lost Girl. And that is the working title of that is The Things We Cannot Change. And it is going to be young adult, again, young adult, I guess fantasy, but I'm still figuring out how to categorize it, but with like a paranormal twist. So it will have a ghost story involved. So I can give a little summary of that if
Yeah, if you're comfortable with it, yeah, go right ahead. A lot of times I don't want you guys to share more than you're really comfortable with, but yeah, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, no, I do give the disclaimer because it's still with readers that like some elements of it could change, but the general plot is, so it's fiction, but it does have very nonfiction undertones to the story. So the main character, Callie, her dad passed away a year before the story takes place. He passed away from complications due to alcoholism. And so a year after his passing, all of a sudden, he is back. She is suddenly accompanied by his ghost. So he is following her around, kind of bugging her and making her plan to kind of bury the past and her experiences with him very hard. And so she has to kind of come to terms with why he's there, figure out what he needs, figure out what she needs in order to get rid of him or help him get back to where he's supposed to be.
Yeah, that sounds like a great story. Question from me, actually, personally, because really, my werewolf book was really my first full book, right? Because I did the children's book before that. But when you're sending your book to readers, because I did the same thing. I sent it to a bunch of other author friends, and like just read through this first draft.
Mm-hmm.
When you do that, because I don't know what the proper technique is, I just did it the way I did it. Do you do that, with your own editing and everything, but not really a fully edited book yet, right? It's really your first just full finished draft.
Yeah. I mean, it's not my first draft. I did a couple read throughs and a couple passes at it, because my first draft of that I finished probably in like 2 months. So it got
it's your first finished.
Yeah,
full draft, right? Kind of.
Yeah. And I did my best to clean it up, typos and edits and things like that. I don't want to give them something that is really hard to read because they're spending all their time, editing typos and things. But yeah, it's pretty early. It's a pretty early draft, but I send it to them at the point I did purposely because it's a story that's so close to me that I want to make sure that it makes sense the way it is. I might not have sent it so early if it were a different story, like The Lost Girl or something. But because it is so close to me, I sent it off very early just to make sure everything I have works and get some very honest feedback about what I might need to change and things like that. But yeah, it's pretty early.
And I found when I did do the werewolf book, I found that feedback to be incredibly helpful, right? Because as usual with anything, when it's really just only your set of eyes, you miss things. And I'm not talking about, spelling and stuff. You'll catch those as you're going through. And I'm not even talking about, missing parts of the story or anything. But sometimes you just miss something because you looked at it, you read it, who knows how many times you've rewritten it, you changed it, and sometimes you just miss things. And I found where a lot of times just small comments, you're like, wow, I didn't even think about that, right? And it's not changing your story, but you're like, I didn't even think about that and realize that the readers are thinking this as you're reading it. And it's really very, very helpful.
Yeah. And it's always a good idea. I think a good test point is when you start to hate it. When you start to hate the story, that's when you need to send it off to someone else to find out if it's
Now it's
actually
ready.
or you're just really not happy with it. You've just
I
spent too much.
hate this, so now it's ready to go.
Yeah. Or at least ready to be seen by your first readers.
So we know what you're working on now. We know you're putting the Neverland world off to the side, right? So that means there's possibly something else in the future. But is there any other future goals as a writer? And what I mean by that is, are there other genres you want to attempt, right? Maybe something you're like, at some point, I do want to try this. Or are there other stories or things that you have thought of? Like most of us, we always have 80 ideas at once that we're just not sure where to go yet. But is there something that you do have in the back that you're like, I really want to do this at one point? Maybe when I'm done with these and this kind of world and direction, something I really want to kind of do in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot I want to do. I just don't have the time. I have a supernatural kind of series started. It kind of started as like a collection of short stories. Actually, the last 3 stories in The Problem with Humans are all connected to each other. They take place in the same world, even though they stand on their own. And I would love to expand on that and really build out that world and kind of create just like a collection of maybe novellas or stories all centered around this one event. And more in Neverland, a Lost Girls in Neverland series may not be completely out of the question. A really out there goal, and I guess it's not out there considering I said a lot of my stories are darker, but I would like to go pretty dark in the future, maybe something not necessarily horror, but something darker than even darker than what I'm doing now, and just really lean into that. So kind of a dark fantasy, maybe.
Yeah.
We'll see.
You know what's interesting, the beauty of it is, all like you're saying, you're trying to figure out where you would put your story, the one you're writing right now, right?
Mhm.
And the beauty of that is almost all of them fit multiple genres, right? Because there's the main genre, kind of like what the overall tone is, but they all have elements of so many of the genres in there, right? And it's interesting, like you say, you don't want to necessarily go horror, but you do want to lean in more to the dark side. But you could easily those darker tones could easily be horror. It doesn't have to be. Again, the beauty of being indie, right? Doesn't have to fully submit itself as a horror piece to really have those tones, to really have that feeling, that atmosphere of a horror story. But the more, like you said, maybe more fantasy or something on that side. So that's always a beautiful thing to see what direction you take that, because it's up to you, right? It's really up to you.
Yeah, which almost makes it a little more overwhelming, knowing that I can choose whatever I want.
That's always when there's too many choices. Then you're sitting there looking like I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly.
But I really enjoyed having you on today. Really enjoyed the conversation, finding out more about your book. Because like I said, I had no idea about the darker undertones, and I really want to check out your book now for that reason. Because again, I love all of that stuff. I love the darker stuff, the horror stuff, anything on that angle. But I do want to just remind the viewers that I will leave all your links down below, websites, socials, the links for the books, everything, so they can find you and everything on that side. Um, I want to remind the viewers, if you have a comment, leave us a comment for either Allison or myself. If you have any questions about books, about what we talked about today, or anything in general, we'd love to hear from you. and definitely subscribe and hit the notifications because there's a tons of amazing indie authors coming up like Allison and all of their amazing work coming up in the future on this podcast. But thank you again, Allison, for being on. Thank you, the viewers, for watching.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Goodbye.
Bye.